I've been working as an intuitive medium since the old days in the mid-70s, 1970s. And I'm also a scholar of the ancient Near East. For me, the Bible is a new work. I work very early on, early material, cuneiform, much of which the Bible derives a great deal from that. You know, from the earlier material. We have the original flood myth. There was no sin in the original flood myth, things of that sort. And as you obviously know by now, I've written a book which certainly is frowned upon by my colleagues in the academy. The main mission is to uproot our fear of death, which to me underpins everything in Western society. Is this working now? Okay, never mind. That's mission number one. And mission number two is forget the word medium. We are all mediums. We are all telepathic. If we weren't, we couldn't speak to our children. We wouldn't have a language. There'd be no civilization, and we wouldn't survive. So what I do is teach people how to make contact if they're not already doing it on their own, or if they are already doing it on their own, which I would say only occurs about 98% of the time, to become more aware of it. My mandate today from Diane is to talk about myself. Now, as an academic, that's really hard to do. You know, we are, it's called self-editorializing, and it's the big no-no. So forgive me if I have notes to push me along. You know, there is this notion of pre-birth planning, and I'm very into this because I do sometimes work or receive information. Sometimes they can be knockouts from people who are not yet born. And they occur, well, I'll leave that till later. But another thing I wanted to mention, that I am going to be talking a bit about suicide, which is on the rise at a terrible rate now. At birth, I had a rebirthing therapy session. Oh, wow, I'm really getting loud. So I turn off this mic, right, with glasses. This is the age thing here. You turn this off? All right. Now I have to lean in too. Where I went through my birth. This is a very standard procedure, was for me, because I was training to be a past life therapist, which doesn't always have that much to do with past lives, but has a lot to do with childhood trauma and accessing the superconscious, which we mistakenly call the unconscious, to find out what that's about and to discharge it. So in order to get this certification, I had to be a patient. This is, again, in the old days. And I was put through the birth situation, went through it, and then flipped into another birth to discover that I was my dead brother. What does that mean? Does that mean that my dead brother doesn't exist and I've completely taken him up, taken his personality within myself? No. My dead brother still exists in the afterlife, and I'm here, and we're the same person. And this is a theme we're going to pursue today. But I just want to mention that this is very, very common, that people who do this kind of therapy routinely ask if there were any abortions, miscarriages, or early infancy births, because we know how confusing that can be to a person's sexual identity, and a lot of other things. So I was born in a climate of mourning, a deep, deep climate of mourning, and it's something that I used to do. I used to be a lavish mourner. Maybe it's that half Italian side of me, I'm not entirely sure, but so a great deal of my life's work is about my own self-healing. And now I reached a point, Alan, I think you're going to know what that is, where I feel the mourning. I feel it deeply. I feel the sadness, and it goes away very quickly. Okay. I did have a near-death experience, but it was not my first of the supernatural stuff in childhood. And I'd like to address them because I think that children spontaneously have these. I think looking for a near-death experience as being an ultimate experience is totally off the mark. truthfully. It can tell us a lot. It certainly is life-changing, but there are many others that children experience, for instance, through nature. And one for me, two actually occurred around trees. As a 7-year-old, I went and put my hands or arms around a very large maple tree and looked up into the leaves and was suddenly swept up into what seemed like the sky in a spiral. And eyes wide, feeling no longer on the earth, realizing that I was in what I called an infinity moment, that all things took place at once, that everything was there, and that I knew it all. Not in a smart-ass way, but just in the way that we actually do in our transcendent beings. And that was an experience that stays with me obviously till today, especially when I launch into long discussions about simultaneous time. And the second one was another great teacher. It took place in a cherry tree, with me climbing up. It was in bloom. It was one of these gorgeous spring days of the sparkling blue sky. And I was looking again up into the sky, looking at the colors of the cherry blossoms and the green and the blue all together. And there started a kind of a shimmering, a sparkling and a shimmering taking place around me, and it became conscious. And I felt it more and more. It was like, it was palpable. And I understood that it was aware of me. This energy was aware of me. It knew everything about me, every cell in my body. It embraced all of that, and every ant on that tree, every cell in that ant, every piece of bark. And this is when I first encountered what I call the presence. I'm not a big one to say this is God and that's God. Anyone who knows me knows that I don't do that. But this is a divine atmosphere, and this is what we live in. And sometimes in the early mornings we wake up and we can feel it, that cocoon feeling and not wanting to come out. This is everyone's experience. And that experience is integral to a good death. Now when the near-death experience did happen, I was 16, and I'm not going to go into the details, and it was not very exciting in terms of what you can hear nowadays, but it put me back into this luminescent atmosphere, this presence, this knowing, this security. And I thought, to stay here forever and never do anything else, just to be in that. Is that all right? And I came back. Now, this near-death experience is not in my book because my editor thought it was so boring, she cut it out. She's probably right. But nevertheless, this experience of this atmospheric presence, this atmospheric divine, which is, maybe atmospheric is even wrong because it drenches us. We form out of it. It's the basic part of reality. And that's why for me, I call God all that is, because that is what gets emanated. It gets emanated on the level we humans can feel it, let's put it that way. Because in deeper levels, it gets much, much wilder, much grander, much stronger. So there are only certain levels that interact with us because we can't take more in our little bodies. You know, that's not a problem. We should enjoy the limitations while we have them. I have gone into a life review. It's funny that the normal stages of near-death experiences, I seem to have done them one at a time. It was quite astonishing. It took place on the Autobahn in Germany. I had hitched a ride from Paris to Hamburg, which is quite a way. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was one of these pile-ups of 11 cars. Now, the Autobahn has no speed limit, and sometimes they have crack-ups of 80 cars involved, or 120. So 11 or 12 was not a big deal. And I was in a sports car with somebody named Axel. The car turned over, went up a hill, turned back over. This guy straightened the car out. And I'm thinking, wow, I didn't think I was going to die now. Wow, that's really interesting. It amused me. And this distancing is something that you see over and over again when the person leaves the body. Whether it's in out-of-body experience, whether it's in regression therapy and you're doing a person's past life or future life death, or when you're actually really dead, a sense of distancing from who we are. And I was already there. Axel and I did not speak for a while as we drove through the blood and the glass on the highway, but eventually he said that he could not let me die because I was innocent. And I said, well, how did you do what you did? How did you make this car, this sports car, come right? He said, Julia, I'm a professional race car driver. I also, I'm supposed to be talking about my experiences, right, Diane? I also went to, once I went to a hypnotist in my early 20s, and this is a real classic jerk thing to do. He asked me to leave my body at death in this life. You don't do that. You know, you just don't do that. Well, I didn't know, and so I'm like a trained seal when I'm in trance. I'll do anything. And I just exploded out of my body and went for a cosmic ride. It was just exhilarating. It was just gorgeous. And it scared the hell out of the hypnotist. Brought me back in. And I find that this, I'm sure that this could be a potential after-death experience for me in this life. And I do know when I'm dying. And I know the circumstances. And so I'm on a deadline. But it could be. But now that I've become a softer, older person, I'm thinking, well, maybe I'd rather see this guy first, or my father, or my mother. You know, I'm sort of toning it down. And I know that our experiences after death really are about choice, and they're about expectation. And this is really my theme for today. The reason why I ended up being a little bit more obviously intuitive than other people is because a single factor in Western society, sadly, is because I had a traumatic childhood. So I spent my childhood trying to squeeze myself into Lady and the Tramp's living room, or going outside praying to Cinderella's fairy godmother, God, angels, Jesus, anything I could seem to get my attention, get their attention, I prayed to. I made tremendous attempts to be invisible and had to be ahead of my parents because, telepathically, so I knew what to expect, so I could defend myself. Now, this is one reason why these talents are so often mixed up with psychosis, neurosis. We don't have to go this route. And what I'm finding more and more is that people are bringing out these abilities. These are inborn, all of them, bringing them out in America in particular, but also because I work extensively in Europe, it's happening there too, and to a lesser degree. And everyone assigns these to great spiritual movement, like a sort of a cosmic clock that's turning around or whatever. And of course that's true. But even truer is we discovered the telephone. And we got used to talking to the disembodied. The truth is, we discovered the internet and we got used to collapsed space and no distance. And third is that we are now drenched in subtle electronic impulses day in and day out, with a cell phone attached to your ear, all of this, and all perception occurs not just in perception in a material reality, but perception, at least of the human variety, alive or dead, occurs through electrical impulses, translated into images, sounds, or whatever, touch. So we are becoming more and more attuned every day to these quiet, unforeseen unsuspected electrical impulses. And truthfully, I think that technology, which is the art of the modern West, is what's doing the pushing. It's a very, perhaps, novel way of looking at it. And I don't believe in dividing spiritual from material. So they work together. They're all expressions of the human essence. In my later years working as an intuitive, I had the opportunity I flipped into, let's say, living with the presence. And it was so strong around me as a field that people actually fell into it. It was quite an exciting time. It was a time when I worked that if I touched somebody, they felt fire through their bodies. Then they had to go to a hospital and eliminate kidney stones or something. I often didn't sleep, sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a time. The amount of beings that were there were just amazing what's out there. And I think the being of light is something. You ought to check out some of these other guys. But what stands for me now as the most unusual aspect of living with the presence? It was not this feeling of love we all talk about, because that's certainly there. It's just a non-stop, because the fear's not there. There's nothing to stop the love, so it just comes out. It wasn't all the interesting beings. It was how I looked at the human condition. And I've always known that you could get beyond the human condition. I've always seen the human condition of misery and drama as an umbrella that hangs over us. And when you're in these states, you get beyond that and start to look at who we are and how we struggle and how much we are constantly creating these problems and how involved we all are in them and how we believe them. And I'm taking a risk by saying it made me die from laughter. I remember going to a film by myself in the middle of the day. I spent a lot of time alone during this period. And there was a murder, this devastating murder that takes place in the film. I don't know what people were thinking. This is in New York. And I'm sitting there just breaking up with laughter. Thinking, oh, this is so hysterically funny. Just knowing, of course, that there's no such thing as death and that we create these great dramas for ourselves. And that, to me, is my first extended experience of what it would be like if we understood we are immortal now and didn't wait until we died. If we could just get that we're immortal now and that immortality doesn't happen after we die, this whole thing, this whole picture, this whole reality would restructure in no time at all. Now, I'd always been doing mediumship as a part of a daily reading, and I was already started doing rescue work in the early 80s, where the troubled dead, because it is true, it's not true that everybody's happy when they leave, and it's not true that everybody's wise when they leave either. And many people who have died need help, and we'll talk about this a little later. But only to say that I wasn't focused on mediumship at that time until I was well into graduate school, up to my neck in work at Columbia University, the toughest, meanest department in that school and probably in the world, nasty and demanding. And a man I love very much went to the hospital, had a standard quadruple bypass, came out, intensive care, and he started leaving his body. And everyone was hysterical. He had absolute, fantastic surgery, fantastic prospects, because he was a very tall man, he had great veins, blah, blah. He's leaving his body. Now, he's been talking about dying only for 4 months before the operation and thinking he's being stupid to talk about it, because the way the doctors described his operation is nothing. I do 3 of these a day. Don't worry about it. And this was the most extensive of my shared death experience. Shared death experience means watching the energy body leaving. You can do this with animals, you can do this with anyone, you can even remote view it. You don't even have to be with somebody to watch this, to watch the body leaving. And with Michael, what was interesting was to watch him leave and go up and float through different layers of colors. And then when they applied the paddles, he came zooming back down into these alarming red zones, and then he'd start to float back out again, sort of sideways. And I think that in himself there was an indecision. But eventually he did leave. And as I am also a reverend, I officiated at his funeral when I was taking care of his estranged family. It was a lot for me to handle. And then the typical stuff starts to happen. When the dead want your attention, they don't stop if they really want your attention. So this is New York City. The doors open in the morning, the apartment doors open. You don't do that in New York. The twittering on the fax machine, the phone ringing, the lights going out, the whole kit and caboodle when they're trying to get your attention. So finally, I'm standing there in the kitchen. I've been resisting, and there he is. Huge, larger than life. The guy was already 6'6", but at this point he looked like about 8 feet. And he was in a panic, a total panic. And so he connected. Getting the connection is important because that means brain synchronicity. When you get the connection, then you're in a telepathic link. But in this case, he was newly dead, so there's more than just that going on. I could hear him word for word. When he realized that I could still see him and I could still hear him, the look of panic on his face and urgency transformed into sparks leaving his body of excitement. A look, his eyes welling up with tears. That's at least how it appeared. His heart opening in gratitude, love, and relief. So we think all the time that we make after-death communication or attempt it because we need it. That's not the whole story. Sometimes they need it more than we do. And that was when I resolved to write a little book on how to do after-death communication, which when I finally got around to it 12 some years later, after spending so much time in the academia, is now over 400 pages, cut down from 600, so you're all lucky about that. I'd also had, my first husband died 11 days after marriage, and when I got home around 5 o'clock in the morning, after spending time with him in a glass sort of cell, and while he was on an iron lung, or a lung machine, breathing machine. I got home afterwards around 5 in the morning. There was a light on my answering machine. In his voice, he's from Jerusalem, so it was very distinctive. Thank you, Julia. So this was not trying to get my attention, which he certainly got, but it just demonstrates that even for one person, how many times they can reach us if we learn the signs. And in the book that I wrote, I have extensive amount of material on all of this and the subtle signs, how to identify them and what to do, and also how to work with it when you want it to happen. My methodologies are far different from Ellen Bakken's over there, but they also work. And in teaching them in workshops across the country and in Europe, I have about a 98% success rate. That's how prepared we are today. It's 98%, not because I'm so successful, but 2% can't do it. 2% won't let them do what's already natural to them. That's the only difference. It's not about me. So, I've had about all I can stand about my own experiences now. And I mean, we're going to have time to talk afterwards and ask questions, which is really the way I like to work most, but with a group this size, it's not so easy. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about I have not really come to conclusions about the afterlife or even after-death communication. There's an enormous amount of questions that I have that I need to get working on. But I have come to some significant observations. And what is clear is that we've got a long way to go before we even penetrate this subject of afterlife. And I can hear, I have a little bit of access to about 200 years from now because I'm very much in touch with an incarnation of mine from then. We're Stone Age, guys. As good as we're doing now, we are Stone Age. It's an embarrassment. They're going to look back on us and say, oh my God, these poor people, how did they survive? Really, studying the afterlife is about studying consciousness unhindered by matter. And most of you, I think, especially those of you who studied or have had near-death experiences, know that our perceptions work better outside of the body than in it, right? 360-degree vision, all that kind of stuff. There are protobiological perceptual abilities that actually do transfer into the afterlife until you don't want them anymore, you don't use them anymore. But the most persistent problem that I see is a stumbling block to going forward and understanding what we call the afterlife, is that we call it the afterlife. That's one thing, as though it happened after now, happens after death, okay? The other one is that we think it's a place. And it's supposed to have what we call in academics is essentialized features. In other words, features that have existed for all time. The afterlife is not only not a place, it is only not in a time zone. It's also highly influenced by individual expectations. And I mean expectations of the deeper self, not the conscious self, your culture, your social status. All of these things will shape what happens to you directly after death. Each person's afterlife is different from another, as the same as each person's near-death experience is different from another. And I got big news, it's the same for an animal. No dog has the same experience, no cat has the same experience, and no joke, I have tried to follow mosquitoes and can't seem to get anywhere with it. So the worst thing researchers could do is to try to standardize the afterlife, and you hear some of this as critique in research where they say, well, this is not the same as that, so therefore neither one is true. The worst thing you could want is to have a standardized afterlife. You ever think of the words, I hope he's in peace, or may he rest in peace? These words scare me to no end. You're never more dead than you are now. Would you want to be in peace now all the time and just be in sort of a static, peaceful state? Forget peace. You're never going to have any peace. The human soul is as restless as anything in existence, and it ain't going to stop. So forget about it. No rest for the weary, dearies. As a near-death experiencer, and as a medium, and maybe a little bit as an intellectual too, it's natural for me to do something that I could never do in the National IANS talks, is to start to look at the differences and the similarities between near-death experiences and permanent death experiences. This is an unpopular topic, and I'm springing it on you, hoping that you'll forgive me if I tread on anything. I have real questions and doubts about near-death experiences being death experiences. But I think as I get through this, you'll be surprised why I have these questions, okay? As an academic, I look for differences first. Similarities start to come together after you've sifted out the differences, and then you see what you can call a universal, something that applies to all cultures, all times. What we know about the afterlife now is what America is producing, and has nothing to do with an afterlife of a Neanderthal or somebody living in France in the 1700s. Okay? even among afterlife encounters, whether they're spontaneous or they're induced either by therapists or mediums or individuals, there are enormous discrepancies. One of the things that bother me, we don't know why. Some will say that a dead person will actually come and embrace the child, the son, or the wife, even hold her all night long. Touch becomes the main vehicle of expression. And in other instances, the dead person will say, don't get near me, don't touch me. Why does this happen? I don't know, and it's going to take me a very, very long time and a lot more research and experience. 40 years is not enough to understand why these things happen. In the same way, I'm not at all clear about why some after-death communication is great, fabulous, and others just fall apart. I know that the atmospheric conditions apply. I know that the capacity for the dead person is crucial. If they were extroverts in life, they have big brains, they make loud brains, I call them, loud brains. And they're great communicators. It has to do with emotion. It has to do with a person's individual receptivity on the side of the living. That's crucial. The higher your emotion is, even the more stress you're in, the more likely you are to be receptive. And speaking of stress, stress has been institutionalized in many religions in order to bring on sacred visions. And just think of near-death experience. It's a stress experience. And in fact, near-death experiencers, those who have them after cardiac arrest and those who don't, the dividing line seems to be that the near-death experiencers also had traumatic childhoods or stressful childhoods. So it all rolls around this. So we don't know. I don't really know why something happens at one time and it won't in another. This bothers me tremendously. I can't imagine. And I get questions like, besides little questions like, what's my life purpose? Over the internet, and sometimes with a phone number for me to call them to tell them what their life purpose is. A lot of people ask me what happens after suicide. Now, suicide is becoming a big problem in this country for young adult males in particular. It's now already outdoing the number of deaths by car accidents. In New York City, where is my home base in America, throwing yourself in front of the subway trains while they're in motion is becoming a fad. So we have to ask what that's about. But nevertheless, the answer to what happens after a person commits suicide is anything goes. There's no one thing. And I just want to give you, use suicide as an example because I work extensively with that. People call me and we sometimes set up teleconferencing among family members and work it through. And the active suicides, in other words, not the ones who died from a drug overdose or just sort of accidentally on purpose fell in front of a train, but the ones who actively do it are usually brilliant communicators. They have high energy and they want so much to get through and they're so damn shocked at what they did to themselves. They can't believe it. I had one guy shot himself in the chest with a rifle. And he was absolutely crazy, a marvelous communicator. And he told me he wanted to go to Ohio. He had a couple friends there who were trying to get pregnant, and he was going to go in and reincarnate. This is shock thinking. A lot of people who don't want to be dead think about coming into reincarnation. And that impulse can be so strong that in my younger years, I used to sort of squeeze my legs together as a response. So this shock value is really very strong, and you have to get their attention when they're newly over and haven't adjusted, won't accept what they've done. You get their attention so they don't do something like reincarnate, because that's another story. Anyway, there was one guy, the happiest suicide I've ever seen in my life was a man I worked with his sister, and he shot himself. I'm using shootings, by the way, just to have some consistency so you can see how they compare. He shot himself in the head in a shower, very tidy. And I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be really something. And there he is in the afterlife, pile of books on grass, hammock, drinking a martini. I thought, what's going on with this guy? He was in absolute perfect peace. He was so glad to be out of here. Now there's an epilogue to this. He left behind a wife who was bordering on dementia. She was a really big problem for everyone. What he actually was doing was getting there ahead of time. She died 3 months afterwards. Actually less than that. So he got there ahead of time to give her the confidence to come over. But just goes to show that what looks like on the surface may have nothing to do with what was actually happening. The third example of differences with suicide is perhaps the greatest tragic thing I can ever think of, even beyond losing a child through suicide, which is something I work with a great deal and love doing. But this was a young man who had murdered, and he committed suicide during the murdering. And when he went over, the agony that he felt that he couldn't extinguish himself entirely was overwhelming. This is something that would never have occurred to me, that after killing yourself and discovering that you're still there and you can't do anything about it, how much pain that can bring. So this was a kind of agony that seemed to ring out for me in the universe. It was unbearable pain. And this guy, from this strength of emotion, is going to be one of the greatest helpers from the other side you could ever name. So it's just an example. Passive suicides, by contrast, can be problematic because often they're hallucinatory or in denial and not good communicators. But not always, really not always, but it's just a general tendency. No one thing that is ever said in anything you ever read, even if I wrote it, can you take as law. There is no such thing as standardization in any form when it comes to consciousness. It's not going to happen. But the people who've died traumatically, people who've died unexpectedly in drowning or whatever, are usually urgently want your attention. They urgently want contact and can be absolutely spectacular communicators. And then there's many who die angry, sometimes because they were told they're going to see Jesus or Mary or whatever, and they didn't. Sometimes because nobody told them they were dying, that they should expect a miracle, and they died. For all kinds of reasons, anger, confusion, it can be tremendous on the other side. And each of those cases tells us something new too. The one thing about after-death communication is that it's always a surprise. Now, many times, something certainly, Alan, you could verify, is the deceased try to make contact with us in order to find reconciliation, either for forgiveness. They don't ask for forgiveness, they show remorse, right? Sometimes the strength of their remorse will unleash forgiveness spontaneously in us, in the living, or to forgive. And we have instances of the deceased coming around the deathbeds of a person who's killed them and given the dying person forgiveness for the murder before he died. So that's how extensive the law of forgiveness is in the so-called afterlife. It's the whole of the law. Without forgiveness, you can never reach who you are. Without forgiveness, there's no authentic self. There's no freedom. Many just want us to know how vibrantly alive they are, which they show us. And I get so much of this, and people die, and it's somebody's been in a wheelchair for 20 years. I can walk again, I can run again, and they're speeding all over the place. Someone I knew who had killed her dogs, put her dogs down because she couldn't take care of them because she was dying from cancer. And who were the first to come when she died? These dogs. She couldn't believe it. My dogs are here, they're alive. And you see this kind of awakening, and often a euphoria. And these are, the euphoria is great, it's wonderful, it's the most exhilarating, gorgeous thing you could ever come across, but it does die down. They get back to work. Through them, though, through these really positive experiences, we get to feel what they feel. We get a glimpse of what they experience. The ineffable love, that's crucial. The freedom is something that we don't have any clue of how free we really are now, not just after we're gone. Sense of safety, overwhelming. Exhilaration, superhuman perceptual abilities. The impossible mobility of just being able to think and you're there, or think and you're that. The energy-charged atmosphere, just the sheer love-drenched magic of it all, with the good ones. And it's in these cases where you get to, of after-death communication, where you get closer to the good near-death experiences. And they're not all good. Something else that is not promoted, certainly not as popular as the beautiful near-death experiences. How many people have really ghastly ones or just not good ones? Landscapes can be very similar between near-death experiences and the permanently dead. There can often be garden scenes, but this is also very cultural. In great antiquity, there were palaces of crystal. Things that really had value were prized. I think as we overpopulate the world, for us, gardens are more important. Fiery angels, murderous angels, carrying swords and things. Thrones. And none of us is going to die and look for a throne any more than we're going to say, where's Valhalla? Where'd you say it was? But a Viking would probably enter something that looked just like that until they're ready to move on. What happens in the beginning is the dead really make constructions. They make things that make them feel good, that bring a maximum inspiration into their world, as we should be doing now. And at this point, when I work with clients, sometimes we can go into those constructions, the invitation of the deceased, and start to walk around in them or explore them. In the same way, the artwork that works in multidimensional levels, it's really thrilling. And I'm hoping to develop this more and more in the years to come. In ancient Mesopotamia, which is my field, the afterlife was the city-state, turned upside down. And the city-state was the ultimate of civilization as far as they understood it, so naturally they made the afterlife a mirror image of what they thought was the best that the world had to offer. And this has the remnants of traditional societies where the afterlife is something you slip easily into. Everybody goes there. It's not just the Christians go there or the righteous go, everybody goes there. And it's just very similar to what was ever beautiful or valued in the life you're in now. It's like the happy hunting ground. That's a reality, that's not just a joke. But more brilliant, this divine energy, this beauty. Now these are mass cultural beliefs, but they affect us. I don't think any Watusi ever had an afterlife image, even on a deathbed, that included pearly gates. Yeah, so our cultural expectation, a dog recreates a food bowl. A wild dog won't do it. The less than positive landscapes are difficult to see in the permanently dead, but for the near-death experiencer who has them, they seem to be quite vivid. And they're much less standardized than the positive ones. This is an area that's kind of hard to talk about because there's so many people who are dead who have problems, who aren't adjusted. And usually I see them stuck in like a mist You don't really see much going on around them. They haven't created anything. They're not doing any of that stuff. They're focused on us. One was Mary Ellen, one of the first that I ever worked on. Took me 3 days to get her accept that she died. She had cancer in the brain, for God's sakes, and was still telling herself she was going to be well. And everyone around her supported it. And then dies, young woman, realizes she left 2 children behind, and was enraged by all of us for not being straight with her. Didn't meet Mary, she was Catholic, enraged by that. And something I want you to remember what I'm saying now is she would only look toward us, she would not look behind her. Just stay with that for a little bit. 20 years after working with Mary Ellen, a psychic told me that there's a very happy spirit named Mary Ellen who wants to thank you. So it did work. There was a guy who was stuck on a battlefield in World War II where he died in reality but didn't know he was dead. 40 years he stayed on the battlefield. What's that about? He got to help. These sort of negative experiences with a near-death experiencer, they just come back. It breaks the experience. But often for people who are stuck in these kinds of hallucinations or denials or refuse to go on, need help from our side because they ain't looking behind them. They're not looking. No one can penetrate them. And so if you ever get that feeling that someone is stuck, contact them. And the problem, state the problem, and the solution will come just like that. And often the solution is quite corny. You feel silly even thinking about it, so you know that's not you. And coming now to the 3 famous features of the ultra-positive near-death experience, which is the tunnel experience, the being of light, and the life review. I think tunnel experience is very rare in other cultures for near-death experiences. In India, they've found some, but I think very few. Being of light one, I think I've read anything from 70% to 50% of positive near-death experiences. So the things that we understand as standard features of the good near-death experience, really, if you look at the statistics, are rare in themselves, often. And in 40 years of doing this work, I've never heard one dead person talk about a life review. I've never heard one dead person talk about a tunnel experience, and I've never heard one dead person say anything about meeting a being of light. Now, why? I still don't know entirely, but I have some theories. First of all, let's talk about the tunnel for a second. Is it a tunnel? Well, it's some kind of passage because it can be described as crossing a river, it can be described as crossing a bridge or something of that sort. What's that mean? It's a frequency shift. Must be. And sometimes when I do have shared death experience, watch a person leave the body, they seem to disappear for a second or two, and then they come back where I can see them again, and I think they've made that frequency shift. This is one frequency shift. There are more to come. I also saw a woman try to climb into a tunnel, tried crawling toward a tunnel as she left her body, as though she wanted to come back into the womb. So some things can be configured as a tunnel experience. But nevertheless, you don't hear about it as a standard from the dead. I have seen people, and this is also something you see a great deal of working in regression therapy and taking people through their deaths, that people just lifting into a golden light. And that occurs, as it did with me in the near-death experience, occurs with near-death experiencers, it occurs in past life therapy, and it occurs in permanent death experiences. We are just lifted into a luminescence. It's extraordinarily peaceful. Now, when I work with sometimes after death experiences, when a person's died very suddenly, usually their need to communicate is so urgent. They can be astoundingly clear, give you point by point what they were doing when they fell into the swimming pool, what they were looking at, what they were thinking, what happened when they fell in, the momentary fear, and then the fascination. This is typical. This sense of fascination, the fear just dissolves in the fascination. Who they wanted to make contact, all these different stages that they go through, they actually can communicate, and never have I heard of the being of light and all this kind of stuff. Occasionally you'll hear of people coming in to greet you, or coming in to help you. It could be an animal. So that's certainly true. That near-death experiences and permanent death experiences have that in common, as do people who are not in either of those situations really, but on the deathbed and having the visitations, which are extraordinarily common, of someone from the other side who's come to escort them or to tell them it's not time. And you also get this immediate removal that comes also to some extent with the fascination. You've got to understand how enveloping this process is. And once we really get that, that's what happens when you die, I think we're all going to rush to the guy who's dying, the gal who's dying down there, because this is going to be the event. That threshold opens, and we all feel it. We all experience something grand. The moment slows down, becomes spacious. It's sacred, and it's exciting. And I think in times to come, we are definitely going to celebrate this. Same time, I'm not so sure that in any near-death experience there's any real choice going on. In India, there are no choices. In India, your near-death experience usually takes place in a bureaucratic office-type situation with a clerk telling you, "I'm sorry, we have made a mistake with you," and you have to go back. We got the wrong spelling of your name, or you're the wrong whatever, Mr. Singh, and there's no choice. Interestingly, in 1970s America, if you look at the documentation, there was no choice about whether you're going back or not. Why? Because you already made the choice. Clear. That you already know whether you're dying or not. So this idea of choice has a lot to do with what we value now and what we're inserting into these experiences, not necessarily a fundamental of these experiences. Same with life reviews. There are an awful lot of people who are still nasty on the other side. Believe me, they didn't have a life review. Or are troubled or in hallucinations. They didn't have a life review. And once they're finally out of that, when they get the help to come out of that, they have an eternity to review their lives. Not a problem. You don't have to do it right away. But in a near-death experience, it's part of the awakening of what needs to change when you come back. I see leaving the body very similarly to the way people in near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences describe themselves. So I would say that is very much a similarity there too. Changes in age, or restoration into wholeness, from disease into wholeness, experience of being whole, of being healed. That's also a commonality between permanent death when it's happening well, and near-death experiences when they are happening well. Again, this contact, attempts to contact the living are quite common on both sides. Sad that we're not more perceptive about this stuff, but we're getting there. The sense of all kinds of locomotion, emotional, psychic, and physical. Hard to talk about it as physical locomotion, that's how it's experienced. We don't have real space-time here either, and we experience physical locomotion, even though there really is fundamentally no space and no time. Now, I was going to go on and talk about reincarnation, but I think I'll wait for someone if they have a question about that, because I wanted really to close this with the idea of redefining we're always using these binaries, life versus death, And I'm beginning to question these categories as I question any binary that comes my way. But here it is. We understand death as the body's demise. Near-death experiences are put in a position that they are in the afterlife because their bodies are dead. Okay? You know, I've seen people in the afterlife operating fully, giving information, and their bodies are fully active, either in Alzheimer's or they're surviving in coma. So you can be dead, I mean really dead, and your body can be alive. And if you've done enough regression therapy with people and take them into infancy, not only do you realize they don't see the way we see is trained, they see more in waves, but they're not in their bodies most of the time either. Are they dead? No. Are people who visit us from the other side because they're trying to get their parents ready for conception, are they dead? The preborn? Are they in the afterlife? I don't think so. I think the categories of alive and dead are problematic and naive. And I think the deeper that we get into what consciousness means, consciousness doesn't respect alive and dead. We're going to have to change all of that. We'll probably, in another 100 years, have another 100 different words for consciousness. We only have one now. It's overused and confuses everyone, and no one can say what it is. The one last thing I want to bring to the table about this is that there are people who are physically dead, cremated, in coffins, physically dead, and they're not in the afterlife either. That's the hard one. Death of the body is not the dividing line. It's not something that a near-death experiencer has to prove in order to legitimate the after-death experience. There's a lot of people who, like Mary Ellen, remember, said, you don't look behind. She won't look behind. She's just focused on us. Hasn't made that change in focus. That's when you're dead. When you're fully focused away from material reality. Near-death experiences, out-of-body people, religious things, ancient ideas of the afterlife involve crossing a border. That's an imaginary border. It's often flowers or even a curtain of energy. With pure after-death communication, it's not necessarily a border, but it's really just a focus. They will not look there or there. They'll look just at you. And your job is, or my job is to get them to see who's behind them and what's behind them, to wake them up to that greater reality. And then something shifts. That's when you get the real frequency shift, when they go. Sometimes people will stay in the state, dead bodies, traumatic deaths, say, in particular, completely suspended, no creativity, nothing, maybe a little angst or even anger that they got shot or hanged or whatever it was from a life before. Turn around, and in the village next to them in a few years, they're back in business again with no afterlife whatsoever. These is the same personality, not the same soul, but the same personality in two different bodies. The lives are contiguous and the memory is spectacular. It can be 95, 98% accurate because the family of the former life are all alive. So we can ask the family questions as the child speaks that this is my wife, this is my house, this is my neighbor, this is my mother, and we can go to that village and find out whether or not this is true, and it usually is. In fact, Schott, Ian Stevenson, who's the greatest of all these researchers, who unfortunately passed away, but his work is being carried on. Schott here might get a mole or something on the side as well as on the exit. All right, there's a whole bunch of material on this kind of thing. So this is one case where I would say that person never really died, just bounced right back into a body. At the same time, people who really are die stay in the afterlife. My brother, who I was also, is in the afterlife. I've had whammy, a double whammy, of a man I had a past life with and a present life with, and I got him in both afterlife states, and you wouldn't believe, back to back, in communication of the most extraordinary, emotional, dynamic communications, back to back, within an hour and a half. And these were two separate personalities, which I understand, these two personalities I understand as the same person. And you can, so I'm doing reincarnation anyway. Sorry, I slipped that in. And you can have, and do have, incarnations that are your contemporaries now. So I'm trying to get you to share with me my excitement about how flexible consciousness is. If it's got big plans or it's got a lot of energy, it'll split itself up in more than one body at the same time. Or there'll be a lot of personalities in one body. Now, I know a woman, and I am that same person, and she knows it. She came to me for past life readings, and I couldn't do it because they were all my past lives. And then we started hanging out together, and we started remembering all the other ones of the marriages or brother and sister when we weren't in the same body, but were in the same family. We both remembered 20 years apart, a future incarnation who contacted us, and is why I'm so certain what stone age we're in now. And I met him first, 20 years before she did. We never spoke about this. His name was Bernard. 20 years later, she calls me. We weren't in very close contact for a long while, and said, I just met my future incarnation. His name is Bernard. And I think to myself, what's going on in Bernard's mind? He's completely, fully aware of both of us. How does he carry us? What will consciousness be like in the future? What will life and death be like in the future? How are we going to look at this? Okay. That's it, folks. Any questions?
Differences in our idea of the afterlife. I would like you to comment on the Islamic afterlife, where they're very idealistic. Their idea of the great afterlife is to exploit someone else. Or am I wrong?
Well, I have no real intention of trying to describe it. I think for every mosque, for every mullah, it's different. Certainly they have certain standards, but I don't think the Christian ones were very good either. These purgatory, I used to bail my grandmother out of purgatory with money when I was 12. She's still burning? Is she, yeah, they're archaic, absolutely archaic. And certainly it's going to be a great shock to most of these people when they get over and realize that it's not there. I've worked with a lot of people who are very religious, fundamentally religious, Christians, Jews, or whatever. The shock can be tremendous. Or they stay in illusion.
Similar to that, can you consciously choose, like in this life, in this existence, is there a way that you can decide what you want there to be when you, if I said I want a white sandy beach with palm trees and a tiki bar.
You might get something better. That can be very boring. You ever been to Bora Bora? Ooh-hoo. But anyway, yes, you can do that. I do, there's lots of things you can do. I do a workshop called Living Your Death, which is a lot of preparation. You're lying on your deathbed in this life. You look back and think of all the places you didn't have the guts to be who you really are. And you start to see the gaps. And you know who's around the deathbed, you know where your life is led, and then you know where you're going. And you can change it all. Yeah. And you can set up an expectation, but I doubt that whatever you've got consciously in mind is really going to fit the ticket, because I think what happens when you die consciously, and you can die consciously with drug death with morphine. I'm talking about dying without blocks more, not Tibetan sense of dying consciously. It's extraordinary. And that beach may turn into something really other. Go ahead.
Questions. Are there different levels of the afterlife? The other thing is in rebirth, does in part of the soul come back as rebirth and the other part stay in afterlife for consultation?
Yes. The second one. To the first one, I'm very anti-levels. I never use the word higher or the words higher or lower. I find, and I'm very anti-Darwin from a scientific point of view. I'm anti-spiritual evolutionary. I think all of these things are poppycock. We're not talking about time dimensions. I know that in myself, I've been a better person in past lives than I am now. So am I evolving backwards? These things are antiquated ideas. And the levels, some things that upset me tremendously is like the Grand Masters, these sort of boys' clubs in the afterlife, and they're still even wearing the rings, these gorgeous signet rings and stuff like, where are we coming from? When are we going to grow up? Levels, let's say the transcendent self is always there. What part your personality is aware of, that's something else. As your personality expands, it becomes more aware of its transcendent self and absorbs the memory and experiences of all things. Yeah, that's what makes you like God. And when you start thinking in those terms of expansion, levels don't make a lot of sense. He's desperate. We'll do him. No, he's tall. That's what it is.
Hi, Julia.
Hi.
And two questions. First, have you studied Rudolf Steiner and his explanations of how to communicate with people
I live in Germany. I can't get away from Rudolf Steiner.
Okay, so now my
But
next
study
question
it,
is-
not necessarily. I don't study other people's systems. If I'm going to do anything, I'm going to read transmediumship stuff and science. I don't study other people's systems.
What transmedia?
Um,
What is that?
some of the stuff that comes out when a person's really out of the way. When you're so deep in trance, you're not there. It's not all of it's good, but some of it's extraordinary. If I'm going to look at this kind of stuff, I don't want to hear another human's interpretation necessarily.
Where do you source your transmedia material?
Seth, Jane Roberts. Well, let me tell you something else. There are a good 15, 16 books that were published after Robert Butt's death that have a meaning to quantum mechanics that you wouldn't believe. They were never published until about 10, 15 years ago, for those of you who are into it.
By Jane Roberts?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's never been anyone or any couple who had more integrity in what they were doing than that.
We know that the angels and the ascended masters have great capacity to perform miracles. I'm wondering,
So do you.
I'm wondering why they don't end war on the earth tone.
When I start to think about ascended masters, I start to think about Victorian England. I'm way too much a social historian to handle this kind of stuff. I look at all of this as a cultural production. And I look for features that really will tell us what are the underlining contours of all of this. But in terms of ascendant masters, that's only going to be something that's conceived in terms of an imperialistic mentality. I'm sorry, I don't believe in them. I believe that there are all kinds of things out there that are, but I don't believe there are boys' clubs, I don't believe there are men's clubs, I don't believe there are certain soul groups. There's every sort of being out there that